While preparing this, I was going through a lot of different thoughts. My background, as you heard, is primarily chemical dependence and substance abuse. And I got really interested in gambling right around, when the casinos were coming. It worked out nicely that I graduated and started clinical practice in about 2010, right when things were happening in the state with gambling. And so in our field of addiction, there was murmurings and there was ideas generating. And I was just a young enough clinician to kind of say, oh, I want to learn everything about everything. And I want to be that person. I didn't really have a specialty or a scope, but just whatever you threw at me, I wanted to soak in. So it happened just to fall into my lap, so to speak. I got really interested then with PGNO, who and Recovery Resources at the time, who was on a lot of the trainings putting on through the state for the clinicians. And so as I learned more, again, as the casinos were coming, the DSM was republished. And so just the perfect timeliness of just being familiar with the different clinical aspects of it. So putting together the presentation today and the slides for what we wanted to share, I was thinking in the sense of, well, from your practice, what might you want to learn? And I appreciate that this is a room of clinicians and learners together. So I'm not going to give a lot of answers. I don't have a lot of answers. The truth is this is a growing field, and that this is something that we are still in the infancy stages of. So it's kind of cool. And I can appreciate that a lot of our work is less than a decade old. Really in the field itself, so much advancement has been made in these past 10 years, and it just continues. So it's a really, really good time as a clinician to be in the field of gambling and treatment. The researchers are fantastic. They're brilliant. A lot of them are home-based here in Ohio. And so I'm just props for that makes them accessible too. If you go to the state conferences and you start shaking hands and networking, you'll see just how approachable they are and how willing they are to share really the cool stuff that they're working on. So a plug for PGNO and their work that they do with that too. Through our objectives today, I want to just go through just some definitions and different models of addiction, looking at just clinical diagnostic criteria between gambling and substance use. I guess I made a risk. I'm operating on the assumption that somebody has some even minimal baseline knowledge of substance use disorders and knowledge. And so as you were with Mike, feel free to jump in and participate and just kind of dialogue through some of this. If you have questions, if I'm saying things that are unfamiliar or you want me to expand on, just shout it out like last time. Then we'll talk about warning signs and different screens. Really the goal for today, I think, is to help us as clinicians learn when we're working with people. They may not come in right away with a presenting problem as I have a gambling disorder. Sometimes they might, but oftentimes we have to kind of help them find it or help them identify that some of the behaviors they're doing really are leading to some harmful consequences, right? Seemingly innocent or seemingly starting out innocent. So we'll talk about different screens that are available too. All right, so I smiled at the question earlier, somewhere over here, about, well, what about why is stock market gambling? And Mike gave some definition of it. And I thought, well, what a perfect intro to my slides, because I started with that. There are so many different definitions of gambling. If you go to Webster, this was not a book dictionary. So type in gambling on the internet. You'll get this Webster one pop up first, and they call it the practice of risking money or other stakes in a game or a bet. And that one's okay. It has some components of risk in there. The money or other stakes, which I know Mike talked about. Gamblers Anonymous, though, they define it a little bit differently. They say gambling is any betting or wagering for yourself or for others, whether it's for money or not, no matter how slight or insignificant, where the outcome is uncertain or depends upon chance or skill. Okay, so they added a little bit to it. The DSM says that gambling is risking something of value in the hopes of obtaining something of greater value. So that adds a little bit. Wikipedia, as of Wednesday. Wikipedia says it's the wagering of something of value on a random event with the intent of winning something else of value, where the instances of strategy are discounted. Now, of those up there, I kind of like Wikipedia, but I can't quote Wikipedia. Like I just can't let myself do that. And so I borrowed from kind of all of them, and I really like just this last one, just kind of putting it as risking something of value in the hopes of attaining something of greater value on a chance or skill-based event whose outcome is uncertain. And if you go through the different definitions, that kind of pulls in all the important pieces, that there's a risk, you risk something that's valuable in the hopes of getting something more valuable on something that is really unpredictable, right? And so with that definition, then that seems to fit what we were talking about earlier with the various types of games, including stock and some of the other ones that we might get to throughout the session. All right, now that took us and that took a couple of steps to get to gambling. So what in the world is gambling problem or addiction? Well, buckle up. So starting with the DSM, and I'm doing this backwards. This slide's not in your sheet, I don't think, but I thought that this is probably just as a background. This is where we have to operate as clinicians. This slide gets us paid, right? This will give us a diagnosis that will allow us to file claims and whatnot. It is important though, as I referenced, that this this criteria is a little bit different than DSM-4. If you remember, if you were practicing at all at the change, DSM-4 put the gambling disorder right in the back, like Mike was talking about, with these impulse control disorders. And it was kind of like, for a lot of clinicians, it felt like it's just this back chapter of other stuff that we don't really, go to that much. In the DSM-5, the recent publication, there was enough evidence, enough research where they said, no, there's something about gambling that we can at least unlock that one. And, we can free it from that vast lock chapter and put it in with the addictions. And that was a really big move, for the disorder itself. We had an understanding of how a behavior, for the first time ever, how a behavior can become addictive, okay? Leading up to that, there was different theories and different models. And some of these, you still hear about today because they are important ones. The components model argued that in order for a behavior to be addictive, that red's hard to see, I apologize. They needed 6 different components. The first one was the idea of salience, or the importance. It has to be very, very valuable for that person. And so they kind of looked broadly that said, if a behavior is important and has that preoccupation piece, then it can be the first component. Next is the mood modification. And so as you're participating in behavior, it should be mood altering. Kind of similar to a substance. If you take a substance, it's going to alter your mood, or else it's not a good substance, right? That's the point of it. So similarly, with a behavior, that if a behavior is going to become an addiction, then there has to be some mood modification component. The next is tolerance, that over time, the behavior starts losing some of that initial high or the initial reward for it, to where you need to embark on the behavior more and more to get that same desired effect. Withdrawal is the next one, that when you stop the behavior, you should expect something to happen. And it's broad, but it looks at emotional components and it looks at physical components, upset stomachs, anxiety, stress, headaches, that are seen with some behaviors. The idea of harm or conflict, that essentially engaging in this behavior is causing some kind of harm. And it's the repetition, it's the continuing of the behavior anyway. So despite the negative consequences, despite the conflict caused, that the behavior is repeated. And the last one is relapse. So the components model argues that in order for a behavior to be addictive, that it has to borrow a lot of the same relapse potential as we see with substance uses. The author of the components model, Dr. Martha Griffiths, he summarized it briefly and said the difference between an excessive healthy enthusiasm and an addiction is that the healthy enthusiasm adds to life, whereas the addiction takes away from it. I think that's kind of a nice way just to crunch it down. Plain and simple, that as a behavior, some things are good and some things can hurt you. And just let that be kind of the guiding tool, right? How many of you have heard of the 3 C's of addiction? What are the 3 C's? We hear about it a lot in work of codependency, right? No, you're trying to cheat, it didn't work. No, the 3 C's of addiction. So when we're working with families, a lot of times we might help teach them that with substance addiction, right, that you didn't cause this, and you can't cure it, and you can't control it. Okay, so the 3 C's come up a lot of times in Al-Anon groups or different literatures of that sort. So with behavior addiction, then there's been an attempt to kind of borrow off that idea and look at the 3 C's and a T. So the loss of control would be a factor. It has to be compulsive and a continued use despite the negative consequences. So this is a little bit different from the components model, but you see a lot of, again, and at these stages right now, there's borrowing, and we think it looks enough like substance use, and so what if we try to mirror this as closely as possible? So you get all these funny acronyms and backronyms that have long been in existence that are starting to creep over now. Go ahead, in the back.
Could you say that again?
Which part?
Didn't cause this and what else?
You didn't cause it. You can't cure it. You can't control it. So if you're working with family members, that's a common one that many of them will struggle with, of identifying with that. They'll feel responsible in some way. They'll feel obligated that they can fix it. Okay. And a T, they threw this T in this one. So 3 C's and a T, where there's a thought or some kind of an obsession about it. Another model that gets brought up is this public health model. That reads awful, I apologize. The public health model says that there's an agent, which would be a disease or a pathogen or contagion of sorts. There has to be a host who would be the susceptible person. There's an environment of the atmosphere, the setting, and then lastly, the vectors, the connection between the agent and the host. The public health model looks at it and says, in order for an addiction to be an addiction, it has to be kind of affecting the larger society, the system of sorts. And they would look at some examples. And so in the medical field, this public health model would take an agent of malaria or the contagion or the disease, and the host, would be the safari guide who is, the susceptible person in the area. The environment would be the jungle, and the vector would be the connection between them. So the mosquito. So the mosquito would carry the malaria to the jungle safari guide in the jungle. Does that make sense? So this health model then gets applied to substance use. Has anybody seen this model in the substance use field? They would, for example, say, well, alcohol was our agent. The host, the person would be a 42-year-old woman with high stress at work. The environment here would be happy hour with coworkers. And the vector then would be the wine glass. Okay. In gambling, they try to make this the same fit, and they say, well, the agent would be sports betting. Your host is a 20-year-old competitive male who's an avid sports fan. The environment here is that he lives in Boston, so he's surrounded by sports. And the vector then would be these daily fantasy app developers or the servers, right? And so in that way, it kind of fits and lets them borrow again off of these models that are in existence already. If you're familiar with ASAM, the American Society of Addiction Medicine, they look at addiction and they say that addiction is a primary chronic disease of brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. That dysfunction in these circuits is what leads to characteristic biological, psychological, social, and spiritual manifestations. And this is reflected in an individual pathologically pursuing the reward and or relief by substance use and other behaviors, okay? That's a lot of words on the screen, but this is an important one. ASAM's publication came out the same time the DSM did, and it references now that other behaviors can be addictive. So they're following suit, they're following the same line. They're borrowing off of kind of the, what was the predecessor of the addiction field. So all that's well and great. So whereas experts used to think of addiction as dependency on a chemical, now they define it as repeatedly pursuing a rewarding experience despite the serious repercussions. Okay, so more experts are getting on board. In 2003 and in 2012, some studies of pathological gamblers took tests that measured impulsivity and noticed that they had unusually low levels of the electrical activity in the prefrontal portions of the brain that helps people assess risk and suppress instincts then. And then in 2005 study leading up to the work of DSM, an 2005 study confirmed from a card game that problem gamblers had lost sensitivity to their high. So when they were winning, the subjects had lower than typical electrical activity in the key region of the brains. So again, looking at that tolerance build. So I did a 90-minute diagnostic assessment on a guy in Cleveland who said, quote, "Losing feels so much worse than winning." He's laughing. I didn't do the assessment, but I knew he was going to do that. It's a wonderful quote, though. I mean, because it's exactly what we're talking about. That Mike's friend who says, losing feels worse than winning feels good. It's exactly that. And so we start learning, recognizing, defending that there is this numbing factor, that there's this tolerance being built, right? So in 2017, researcher Daniel Kartofel and his team, from all the international researchers, I think there was 6 or 9 different researchers in this group. I'll find you. They started looking at, well, where are we at so far? We've started looking at addiction, at behavioral addiction from the lens of substance use addictions. And a lot of it fits and a lot of it makes sense. But they said, but the methodology of getting there, they started to challenge. They said, we don't know, that there's too many different definitions popping up and they all can't be the same. And so what he recognized is that at this point, there's really no good framework, no theoretical framework for behavioral addiction. And so they said, let's slow down and let's not just assume everything at this point that A equals B and that substance use equals behavior. And they said that the real risk of thinking this way is that there can be some seemingly, if any behavior can become addictive, then it really starts losing the value of the behavior addiction set, and it waters it down. And his team was concerned that they're going to lose a lot of credibility as diagnosticians and clinicians then working in the field. So they started framing this in a way that said, let's just propose to the research world some kind of similar components that would go into it. So they said in order for a behavior to be considered an addiction, it needs to be ongoing without reduction, despite the negative or despite the significant harm that impairs functionality. So there's that negative consequence or the conflict component, and it has to be persistent. Okay, plain and simple, that you're doing something that hurts you for a long time. Let's just start with that, they said. He went on to say that in order for the behavior to be considered addiction, it cannot be a condition of another underlying disorder. So if it arises in, manic state of bipolar disorder, it cannot be willfully chosen. It cannot be functionally non-impairing. And it cannot be just a conditional coping mechanism. And so we'll see in a few moments as we look at different screens that are available through here, they're measuring different things. And what they're saying is like, let's just start with this general framework. Thank you. You had a question? Go ahead.
With the individual that made that statement, how would you characterize or identify if he in treatments or realizing there's a problem?
Are you specifically him, that person?
Yeah, like, or if that those statements were being made.
Okay, so the question was, if somebody makes a statement like that winning, or that losing hurts so much more than winning feels good. Was that your question? What might you respond with, or how might you intervene?
How would you characterize is that person ready for treatment, realizing they have a problem?
Oh, I see. That's a great question. So I'm gonna take your question and turn it this way, because there's a lot of possible ways, I think. What are some ideas if somebody said that to you? What might you start wondering? Go ahead.
Well, I would wonder what stage of change they were in.
Yeah.
I was thinking that they were at least contemplating, if not moving into preparation. Okay, that's the first thing I thought of. And I have a piggyback question. Did they ever do an ASAM continuum of care for gambling? Because I can see the one.
It's a great question.
In my mind, but I can't think of one because I don't know what a residential option would be for gambling.
Yeah. So these are great questions, and I'll go in order. So part of your thought, Nathaniel, would be that we should measure a stage of change and kind of see, well, where do they fall in their readiness to change? Are you familiar with the Eureka stage of change scale? It's a scale. It's actually kind of cool. URICA. It's the University of Rhode Island Change Assessment Scale. URICA. They call it the Eureka. It's a scale that after 40 questions, I think it's 40 now, they might have toned it down a little, but at the end of it, you score it up and it plots somebody right in the stage of change language. It's really nice because as the respondent takes the questions, you're using their own responses. And so there's some clinical discussion and dialogue about, well, I think this and I thought that, but really it's kind of like they're saying, this is how strongly I feel about this, and this is where I respond with that. And so as you turn it around and kind of score it with them and go through it, you can say, it seems like, from your responses, you're in this contemplation state. Does that sound right? Here's kind of what it means. So anyway, that scale exists. Play with it because it's a fun one. They borrowed off that one. So now there's a Eureka gambling scale. And it's very similar. I mean, it's almost identical. They've swapped some language out, but it can be used in the same capacity. Is it valid? Is it reliable? I don't know. It's available. And that's what we're going to find for a lot of these screens, that some of them are better than others. But this one, I think, does a good job. If you come from the framework that substance use addiction is real and follows this pattern, and so gambling then or other addictive behaviors should look the same way. If that's your baseline, you'll do great with it. What these authors are proposing something a little bit different. And then Nathaniel, your follow-up question was about the ASAM, continuum of care. Yeah, so in your ASAM books, if you flip all the way back to the back, you'll find a little section, a little chapter about gambling disorder. And what it recognizes at this point of time is that the options, the different levels of care options are not as available. That's not to say that it's not needed, and that's not to say that it's not clinically relevant, but it's saying that as clinicians, we need to be aware that what we recommend might not be an option. If someone needs a higher level of care, we might have a hard time finding it. But it's important, though, as clinicians, that we recognize that this severity is at a point where it seems elevated. And so it allows for some creativity. And, so what could some different interventions be then? Also, I don't have this slide in here, but I liked Mike's slide, and I should have put it in. He had one in there about just the line of progression, essentially, how there's the different types of gamblers, and that, a lot of times it starts out as just a thing, kind of a social gambler, somebody just trying it out and seeing, well, what's this like, and experimenting, so to speak. In the line of progression model of substance use addiction, we'd see that in as an experimental phase, right? And then we see that over time it gets worse. It's a great slide, and it's a really good conceptualization that a behavioral addiction doesn't just happen. If there's a genetic component to this, and there seems to be some semblance of it, it doesn't just get activated and then you find yourself really struggling with this behavior. There's a buildup to it, okay? So it allows us then to go to this concept of the different types of gambler. Early literature talks about there's these two types, and they call it an action gambler or a classic gambler, and this escape. So action versus escape. In the original theory, it wasn't that bad in this, if you looked at it in the sense that the action gamblers were around the action. There was something about the way that they were gambling and the style that they would do that was energizing, that was stimulating. And so typically these action gamblers were going to be more impulsive with their betting. They enjoyed the thrill, as we said. A lot of their games are games of skill, where you have some decision made or put into it. Things like poker or blackjack or sports betting. And then typically they were mostly males. The escape gambler, conversely, these gamblers are primarily will gamble to relieve emotional pain. And that might be depression or stress, loneliness, boredom. And you'll find these ones really more in solitude, where they can just be alone and kind of disappear into the game. And there's not a lot of other energies of people playing. There's not a lot of distractions. Slot machines are fantastic examples where it's just me and the machine. Scratch lottery, online games where you don't even need to leave the home anymore. They saw that these games are mostly games of luck, where there was no real decision making involved. It's just it'll hit or it won't. And then they found that there was, this would tend to be more females. This model existed for a long time and was kind of all they had. And it's still relevant in some contexts today, but Alex Blazinski and his team, and who was also on the other one that we referenced, they challenged this one too. They're a group of challengers. And they said, well, there's got to be more to it. Everybody can't just be in one of two types. So they said there's three types. So, but it's actually a cool model. So what they did, this team, is they looked at there's a pathway 1, 2, or 3. He started with saying that in order for a pathway to be activated, there has to be some concepts, that there's these ecological factors that Mike was talking about, where there's just the access to it and the availability to it and the acceptability. So there's these pieces where it's around and it's normalized, okay? There has to be some kind of cognitive distortion, that this belief that the game is has a higher importance than maybe it does, or that I have a certain skill that may be artificial, some kind of false belief as it's in there, and some conditioning effect. And so the experience of the pairing, when I gamble, I win, you know, I enjoy it. And it's available, and so I'm more likely to repeat it in that kind of habituation of it. Those three components are kind of all it takes for pathway one. And it's a nice model because it says, well, anybody with a beating heart can follow some basic psychology and say when something's available and you do it and it becomes a habit, you're more likely to repeat it again and again and again. Okay. Eventually turning into a problem.